Thomas Wells had spent over a decade working as the gravedigger for St. Augustine Cemetery. It was a lonely profession, but he found solace in the quiet. The rhythmic sound of his shovel striking earth and the rustle of leaves in the wind were comforts in an otherwise somber existence. He never expected his routine to change, until the day his shovel hit something harder than stone. The discovery came on a cloudy afternoon as he prepared a plot for a recently departed parishioner. Beneath the shallow soil, Thomas uncovered a trapdoor. The wooden surface was ancient, its grain warped and blackened with age. Curious but cautious, he cleared the surrounding dirt and unearthed an iron ring embedded in the wood. When he tugged it open, the groan of rusted hinges echoed across the empty cemetery. Beneath the trapdoor lay a dark tunnel, its descent steep and uninviting. A strange smell wafted from below, damp and metallic, tinged with decay. Thomas peered into the void, the faint light of his lantern revealing stone walls slick with moisture. He hesitated, unsure of what lay ahead. Something about the tunnel unsettled him deeply, but his curiosity warred with his unease. That night, as he lay in bed, he couldn't stop thinking about the hidden passage. What secrets lay beneath the cemetery? His dreams were restless, filled with images of twisting tunnels and dark figures. When he awoke, he resolved to investigate further. The following day, Thomas returned with a lantern and a crowbar. Before descending, he noticed something he hadn't the day before: strange symbols carved into nearby tombstones. The markings were intricate and unfamiliar, swirling patterns interspersed with angular lines. They seemed out of place among the usual names and dates. As he ran his fingers over the carvings, he felt an inexplicable chill. Steeling himself, Thomas descended into the tunnel. The stone steps were uneven, and the air grew colder with each step. The tunnel walls were lined with ancient murals, their paint faded but their imagery unmistakable. They depicted scenes of rituals, figures cloaked in shadow, raising their hands toward a monstrous entity. Its form was abstract, more suggestion than detail, but its presence was oppressive, even in art. The deeper he went, the more vivid the murals became. Thomas felt as though the eyes of the painted figures followed him, their gaze heavy with judgment. He began to hear whispers, faint and indistinct, like voices carried on a breeze. They spoke his name, soft at first but growing louder with each step. He dismissed them as tricks of the mind, the result of fear and the oppressive atmosphere. As he reached the bottom of the stairs, he found himself in a sprawling chamber. Piles of ancient relics filled the space: chalices, rusted swords, and shattered urns. At the center stood an altar, its surface stained dark with what he feared was blood. Surrounding the altar were decayed corpses, their faces frozen in expressions of terror. Above them, another mural loomed, depicting the same monstrous entity, its form more distinct. Tentacles stretched outward from a central mass, reaching toward the figures below. Thomas stumbled back, his lantern flickering. He wanted to run but found himself rooted in place. The whispers grew louder, forming words that seemed to resonate within his skull. "You found us," they said. "You woke us." Thomas barely remembered climbing back out of the tunnel. His hands trembled as he replaced the trapdoor, covering it hastily with dirt. He told himself it was over, that he would leave the discovery buried and return to his routine. But the symbols on the tombstones haunted him, their meaning just out of reach. The whispers followed him, faint but persistent. He began seeing the symbols everywhere, not just on the gravestones, but etched into the bark of trees, scrawled on scraps of paper, even scratched into the glass of his bedroom window. Sleep became a rare luxury, his dreams plagued by visions of the murals and the altar. One evening, as he walked through the cemetery, Thomas noticed a fresh symbol carved into a mausoleum door. This one was different from the others. Larger, more intricate. It glowed faintly in the moonlight, as if alive. Unable to resist, he traced its lines with his fingers. A sharp pain shot through his hand, and he pulled it back to find his palm bleeding. The wound mirrored the shape of the symbol. The whispers surged, a cacophony of voices speaking in unison. They told him to return to the tunnel, to uncover what lay beneath. Thomas resisted, but the pull was undeniable. He felt as though the cemetery itself was watching him, urging him forward. The next day, Thomas sought answers. He visited the local library, poring over old records and maps of the cemetery. He learned that St. Augustine had been built over the ruins of an older settlement, one with a dark history. The settlers had vanished under mysterious circumstances, their disappearance attributed to plague or famine. But Thomas found accounts of rituals performed by the settlers, ceremonies meant to appease something they called the Veiled One. The descriptions matched the murals. The settlers had worshipped the entity, offering sacrifices to keep it dormant. Thomas realized the cemetery had been constructed to seal the site, its hallowed ground a barrier against whatever lay below. But now, he feared, that barrier was failing. Determined to learn more, he sought out the town's oldest resident, a reclusive woman named Agnes. She lived in a decrepit house on the outskirts of town, her presence as much a part of local legend as the cemetery itself. When Thomas explained what he had found, her expression darkened. "You should have left it alone," she said. "The Veiled One sleeps, but it dreams. And its dreams are hunger." Agnes explained that the settlers had performed their final ritual in desperation, sealing the tunnels and sacrificing themselves to ensure the entity remained trapped. The symbols, she said, were part of the spell, a language of binding. But time and neglect had weakened the seal, and Thomas's discovery had disrupted the fragile balance. "It's awake now," she whispered. "And it knows you." Agnes's warning did little to dissuade Thomas. If anything, it deepened his resolve to uncover the truth. He couldn't ignore the voices, the symbols, the way the cemetery seemed to breathe with a life of its own. The Veiled One was awake, and it was watching him. His nights were restless, the whispers keeping him on edge. He began seeing shadowy figures at the edges of his vision, shapes that disappeared when he turned to face them. The air in the cemetery grew heavier, the silence more oppressive. Even the birds stopped singing, their absence leaving an unnatural stillness. One night, unable to bear the weight of the whispers, Thomas returned to the trapdoor. He descended into the tunnels with a lantern and a notebook, determined to document what he found. The air grew colder as he descended, the stone walls damp and slick. The murals seemed to shift in the flickering light, their figures more vivid and menacing. He reached the chamber once more, the altar at its center bathed in an eerie glow. The relics seemed to pulse with life, their surfaces etched with the same glowing symbols he had seen above. The corpses around the altar looked different, less decayed, as if something was restoring them. As he approached the altar, the whispers became words again, louder and more distinct. "Join us," they said. "Complete the circle." Thomas's vision blurred, his head pounding as the voices grew overwhelming. He dropped to his knees, clutching his head. Images flooded his mind, rituals performed in the chamber, the settlers' desperate faces, the entity's looming presence. He saw himself among them, standing at the altar, his hands raised in supplication. The tunnel system stretched far beyond the chamber, connecting to crypts and mausoleums throughout the cemetery. Each crypt held its own horrors. Skeletal remains posed in grotesque tableaus, carvings depicting the settlers' final moments, and artifacts imbued with a dark energy. Thomas felt as though he were walking through a graveyard of forgotten sins. The deeper he ventured, the more the tunnels seemed to change. The walls became smoother, their surfaces covered in the glowing symbols. The air grew thicker, making it harder to breathe. The shadows became more pronounced, moving with a life of their own. In one crypt, Thomas found a journal belonging to one of the settlers. The entries were frantic, detailing the rituals and the sacrifices made to bind the Veiled One. The final entry was a warning: if the seal is broken, the Veiled One will rise. Its hunger is eternal, its reach infinite. Do not wake it. Thomas realized he was too far gone to turn back. The cemetery's secrets were unraveling, and he was caught in their web. Thomas returned to the altar one final time, determined to end what he had started. He carried with him the journal and the knowledge it contained. The settlers had left a way to rebind the Veiled One, but it required a sacrifice. As he stood before the altar, the whispers became deafening, the shadows closing in around him. "You cannot stop us," the voices said. "You are ours." But Thomas refused to submit. He recited the settler's incantation, the words burning his throat as he spoke. The altar pulsed with light, the symbols flaring brighter than ever. The shadows screamed, their forms writhing as the incantation took hold. The Veiled One's form began to manifest, a towering figure of shadow and hunger. Thomas felt its presence bearing down on him, its tendrils reaching for his soul. With a final burst of strength, he completed the ritual, slamming the journal onto the altar. The chamber erupted in light, the shadows disintegrating as the Veiled One let out a deafening roar. The murals cracked and crumbled, the symbols fading. The whispers ceased, leaving only silence. When Thomas emerged from the tunnel, the cemetery felt different. The air was lighter, the oppressive presence gone. But he knew the cost of his actions. The Veiled One was bound once more, but its hunger remained. And Thomas carried its mark, a scar on his soul that would never fade.